Okay, we're going to get started. My name is Gary Wilder. I'm the director of the Committee on Globalization and Social Change. Very glad people are here, even though I know there are a lot of other things going on inside and outside the building. But hopefully we can make some connections between the history Greg writes about and the world we're sadly confronting now. I'm very pleased to welcome Grandin and Laurent Dubois and Duncan Faherty to the event. The way we're going to do this, as you know from the posters and the advertisement, we just want to have a kind of informal, unscripted conversation with Greg about this terrific book he wrote, Empire of Necessity. A couple of years ago, Greg was gracious enough to come and talk with us about Laurent's book, Haiti, the Aftershocks of History, and we had a really wonderful conversation. And in the Committee on Globalization, we're always building this extended family. So these guys are now part of the extended family, and seem, now that Empire of Necessity has been out for a while already, that it would be a great opportunity to switch things around and continue in that kind of open way. So the way the format is going to go, I'll briefly introduce these guys. Greg will start us off with some opening remarks about the book. We understand that some people will have read the book, some people will have read about the book, some people will be interested in the topic and won't know anything about the book. So hopefully in the course of the conversation, the outlines and the sense of the thing will come out. So these guys are going to talk for about an hour, and then we'll open it up to a bigger conversation. But briefly, let me just introduce them so we can not have any interruptions. Many of you know Greg Grandin, who is the author of so many books. Most recently, Empire's Workshop, Fordlandia, and Empire of Necessity. He's written books before that, too. He's now currently finishing a new book tentatively titled A People's Obituary of Henry Kissinger, which is going to be published September.
He's still alive.
Yeah, even though he's not. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Published in September 2015. And we know that Greg is a professor of history at NYU, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and has written on so many different topics in so many different venues, which hopefully is what we're going to talk about also, public history. Laurent Dubois, to his left, is the author of Avengers of the New World, about the Haitian Revolution, Soccer Empire, about soccer and the French Empire, A Colony of Citizens, about Guadeloupe in the 18th century. As I just mentioned, the Haiti book, Aftershocks of History, which is about 19th century Haiti, and is now finishing a book on the banjo, the global history of the banjo. Among other things, Laurent is a professor of Romance Studies and History at Duke, and director of the Center for French and Francophone Studies. And is the Haiti Lab still going, or has that been?
It's no longer. No, it's the
was the director of the Haiti Lab and is now the director of the Forum for Scholars and Publics at Duke. So someone else committed to public history and getting what we do into the world. And Duncan Faherty is an associate professor of English and director of American Studies at Queens College and the CUNY Graduate Center. He's co-editor of Studies in American Fiction, curator of the Just Teach One Digital Humanities Project. He co-facilitates the Revolutionizing American Studies initiative here at CUNY that has hosted so many events that we've welcomed. And he's the author of Remodeling the Nation, the Architecture of American Identity, 1776 to 1858. And he's now working on a book about the Haitian Revolution and the early American novel, so is a perfect interlocutor. And maybe most importantly for me, Duncan is a crucial and key and beloved member of the Committee on Globalization and Social Change, and has been someone that we've been in such close dialogue with over the past few years. I'm going to resist the temptation to rave about Greg's book. Hopefully I'll get a chance to say a few things, but You guys have all seen it. Empire of Necessity. Buy this book. It's a really brilliant, amazing book that links up so many different fields, is deeply scholarly, and is a deep meditation on very complex political, historical, theoretical issues about slavery, capitalism, and forms of domination. But it's also written in this very accessible, straightforward style. And as a third prong in the amazing trident of this book, in my mind, is that it's literary without exactly being writerly, which is to say, like, it's a really haunting book that reads in a novelistic way. It's very moving and a powerful piece of writing, but it's not mannered in any kind of way. And he just has pulled off an amazing balancing act, which we will talk about. So thank you for sharing your time, and let's just have a conversation. Is that right?
So Gary asked me to just set up the conversation a bit and then open it up for discussion here. And you know, one of the drawbacks of this book is there's really no way to describe what it is without giving away without giving away a spoiler, and that is that the West Africans were in charge, right? They were, you know, it takes off of a story that Herman Melville wrote in 1855, midway between the Moby Dick and the Civil War. It was just a very consequential moment in the author and the nation's life. Moby Dick was a critical and commercial failure. He thought he was writing the book that we think Moby Dick is now, the American novel, but at the time it wasn't received that way. And then scholars of Melville date that as the beginning of his physical and emotional collapse. And the coming of the Civil War in the early 1860s, Melville, in between those two periods, Melville writes this incredible short story called Benito Sereno, which he publishes in 3 parts in a New York Journal monthly called Putnam's Monthly. And it tells this incredible story of a North American sea captain, Amasa Delano, who boards what he thinks is a distressed Spanish slave ship in the Pacific off the coast of Chile, and he spends all day on board. And he knows something's wrong, but he can't quite put his finger on what it is that is troubling him. Sometimes he thinks that the Spanish captain, Benito Sereno, is conspiring to, is really a privateer and is working and is plotting to seize his ship. He seems fascinated by the relation. He is fascinated by the relationship between Benito Sereno and the man who's introduced as his personal slave, his black body servant, Babo, and he's told that the ship had hit a storm rounding the Cape, and that hit the doldrums, and then fevers hit, and that's why there aren't too many Spanish. There was hardly any Spanish crew. There was dozens and dozens of West Africans. And Melville tells the story all through the point of view of Amasa Delano. It's really exactly a kind of very opposite in form to Moby Dick, where Moby Dick is a sprawling story that takes place in multiple oceans with men of all races. Benito Sereno is really claustrophobic. It really kind of takes place in the psychological worldview of this New England sailor, Amasa Delano. And as I already gave it away, it turns out the West Africans weren't slaves. They had been slaves, but they had risen up weeks earlier, seized the ship, demanded that Benito Sereno, the Spanish captain, take them back to West Africa. Benito Sereno stalled. Then they came upon Amasa Delano's ship, and they decided to come up with this elaborate charade where they would pretend to be, they would re-inhabit their former position as slaves, and Babo would pretend to be Benito Sereno's personal servant so he could keep watch. And Melville keeps all of this secret from the reader. He doesn't let you know that the West Africans are in charge until he got 2/3 into the story. And then he manages to fill it in through this very ingenious plot device, which we could talk about later. And it's this remarkable story, and it turns out that it's all true. And it's not true the way Moby Dick is true. Moby Dick is based as much on the stoving of the whale ship Essex as it is on King Lear or Milton. Melville pretty much it's plagiarized chunks of the memoir of the real Amasa Delano. And you could, there's nothing, Melville left no letters, he left no diaries, correspondence, what was that attracted him to the story at this moment of personal and national crisis. But if one reads the actual memoir, one might be able to speculate. As Amasa Delano himself tells the story, it was this audacious charade that these West Africans managed to pull off this 9-hour pantomime of the master-slave relation and trick an experienced mariner. Amasa Delano had circumnavigated the globe twice already. This was his third major voyage. He was an experienced mariner, and yet he couldn't see what was in front of him. There's a certain kind of idiocy in the memoir that is conveyed that Amasa Delano, the real Amasa Delano, reproduces. That I think it attracted Melville to the story. The way he tells it is just, it reveals this quite remarkable kind of, it has the psychological depth of a Greek drama and a kind of symmetry, a triangular symmetry of a play, in which these West Africans who had already experienced this, not just the Middle Passage across the Atlantic, but a second Middle Passage across all of the Americas and over the Andes and into the Pacific, managed to you could imagine what the temptation would have been. They were starving, they were thirsty. 2 women and 2 children had already died of dehydration. By the time that Amasa Delano boarded the ship, there must have been enormous temptation to either assault Delano or surrender, whatever it would have taken in order to get food. But they managed to somehow summon up the things that slaves were said not to possess: discipline, interiority, cunning, in order to give the lie to the things that slaves were said to be, simple-minded and loyal. And Delano, the real Delano, kind of reproduces this in his memoir in remarkably transparent ways that I think Melville picked up on. So what I tried to do was use that story as the beginning point of this larger history that basically tells 2 narrative arcs. One follows the West Africans into the Americas in the early 1800s, before the explosion of chattel slavery in the U.S. South. So it gives a different perspective. It kind of steps back, and across the Americas and into the Pacific. And the other narrative arc traces Amasa Delano out of New England into the world. The real Delano is a kind of fascinating character. He really was a new man of the American Revolution. He was born in the last year of the 7-Year War. He was a young man during the American Revolution, and in very tangible ways, the American Revolution kind of catapulted him into world history. He came from a town, Duxbury, that was an early kind of seedbed of what would later become Unitarianism, kind of optimistic Christianity that shed all of that Calvinist gloom. A lot of the major theologians that would go on to be very prominent within Unitarianism comes out of Duxbury. He was, in many ways, a kind of, he embraced the radical promise, the idea that you could be self-creating, that you could use your discipline, you could use your passions, use your virtue and use your reason in order to tame your instincts and your passions, in order to govern yourself, and extrapolating from that would be the foundation of Republican self-governance. And he couldn't make it work, right? In the world, he was largely failed at everything. He gets to ceiling, which we can talk about a little bit later. And so telling those two stories and how they come together in the South Pacific allowed for a broader panorama of New World slavery and to think a little bit about from a different perspective. I mean, I think I've talked enough about it. So maybe should we open it up for questions? I mean,
yeah,
these are very discussions.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks for talking with us today. I guess one, or maybe a place to start, in the introduction you talk about who came to this project was in part by teaching in this room for the first time in a course on American exceptionalisms. And so I wonder, how did coming at this book in that way, and so much of what this book is about is the lack of exceptionalisms, right? It seems to me that some of the fascinating stuff that you're uncovering is the ways in which the very slaves that will rebel in the Pacific are in fact kind of held or held captive or held as commodities by the British and the French and the Spanish and marched across the Indies, right? So New World slavery is not exceptional anyway. Almost every imperial power, and then finally the U.S., right, in Delano's assertion, has a hand in their enslavement. So why exceptionalisms? Why were you thinking about Melville in that class in the first place? And then could you use that as a way to sort of talk about how the book kind of thinks through and explores the kind of quotidian violence against Africans all across the Atlantic by all of these imperial powers? I mean, one of the fascinating things, it's a really long-winded question, one of the fascinating things for me in this book is the sort of work you do in sort of talking about the French Jacobin ship captain, right, who actually captures the British slaver that these West Africans are on off the coast of Biafra, and then transports them across the Atlantic, right? So that his revolutionary politics are anti-slavery, and even I think you have him reporting that he wished he could have done more for the blacks, right? But he enslaves them, he captures this Liverpool slaver off the coast of Africa and then moves them across the Atlantic. So could you talk about how the way in which you're kind of putting pressure on, what is really, I think probably one of the 2 or 3 most taught 19th century piece of U.S. fiction. I mean, it's taught in Emmons schools.
Benito Sereno.
Benito Sereno, for the ways in which it allows people to talk about Haiti in particular, and for the revisions that Michael makes in that way, and talk about the Caribbean, and talk about slavery, and talk about the coming of the Civil War. But really explode that to sort of think about the kind of global dimensions that, in fact, these enslaved bodies carry with them.
Well, in terms of let me answer the first part of the question first about how I came to it. I was teaching a class on American exceptionalisms, and the premise of that class tries to look at sovereignty and rights in an American perspective, a comparative perspective, and the kind of vulgar contrast is that in Latin America there's social rights and a commitment to national sovereignty, and the United States represents individual rights and a commitment to expansion, undermining national sovereignty as much as possible, and thinking about how those two complexes, that's social rights sovereignty complex and coming out of Latin America, and individual rights expansionist complex that the U.S. represents, forms with the different comparative colonial experiences of Anglo-colonialism and Spanish colonialism. And I was just assigning Benito Sereno as a literary kind of illustration of different aspects, thinking about slavery as the common institution that brought together these 2 different colonial experiences, because in some ways the contrast between Amasa Delano as the kind of Yankee innocent and Benito Sereno as the corrupt and decadent old world representing the old world empire. It's very illustrative and nice and useful to teach on its own term. And I was just preparing for the class. I was just reading around for it, and one of my favorite political theorists is Michael Rogan, and he has a great book that compares, that subversive genealogy that makes a comparison between Marx and Melville. He makes an argument that each in their own way, Marx and Melville are wrestling with foundational contradictions. Melville through romance and Marx through political theory. And he has some great pages in there on Benito Cereno. So I'm reading it. And it wasn't by no means am I the first person to realize that this is based on a true story. Literary theorists have known that Melville got this from Amasa Delano's memoirs, at least since the 1920s, the Melville revival, but even earlier, that when Benito Cereno was published, people see there was a few kind of snide remarks that Melville stole it from the real Amasa Delano in reviews. But in any case, I was reading Michael Rogan to figure out something to say in class, and there was, I think it was in a footnote, he just says that the real Amasa Delano or something like that. I remember staring at that footnote. I mean, I say this every time I present on this book. I remember staring at that footnote. The real Amasa Delano. The real Amasa, there was, and it kind of sunk, it started sinking in that there actually was a real Amasa Delano. And it was kind of, and I make this joke, excuse me if you've heard it before, but I can't help it. It was kind of like being told that Ridley Scott's Alien was true. Because in a lot of ways, Benito Cereno is the same structure of that film. You know that there's something wrong on the ship. You know there's evil lurking on board, but you can't figure out who or what it is, and then all of a sudden it bursts out. And that's exactly what Melville does. And it's being the age of Google Books. I Googled Amasa Delano in Google Books, and there was the full read, non-copyrighted version of his memoirs, and 500 pages, and there was the chapter that Melville transcribed large chunks of it to write Benito Cereno, and from there I just kind of got pulled in. As to the question of exceptionalisms, I think this is the standard, right? Kind of Louis Hart's question about comparison, right? Just because I think there is something exceptional about U.S. liberalism and republicanism. There is a kind of idiocy that I think is rooted in settler slavery colonialism that Melville himself was wrestling with, and that Amasa Delano in some ways represents. That the question is complicated, but in some ways, on board that ship, and why that's such a great set piece, is that you have not just Benito Cereno representing Catholicism and Catholicism's complicated relationship or understanding between freedom and necessity. You have Amasa Delano, who understands freedom and necessity as two opposing things, not related at all. You have a kind of more Catholic version in which the relationship of freedom and necessity is a little bit more understood as interdependent. It turns out that the West Africans, the historical West Africans, were Muslim. And so you had three of the world's great monotheistic religions on board that ship, each with their own kind of very complicated relationship to the question of freedom of necessity. And again, to put it in extremely vulgar terms, Amasa Delano represents the kind of blindness that comes from understanding your freedom as in opposing, right? There's in absolutist terms, right? And the kind of and in some ways, I think that was Melville's wrestling with the question of slavery himself, which we could come back to.
I mean, there's a lot of wonderful things about this book. One of them is that there's a kind of it kind of draws you in as if this is a sort of somewhat straightforward narrative history, right? I mean, in a sense, where it's written on one level as a narrative history of these stories coming together. But that's just only the beginning. I was thinking that it's a little bit like if Borges wrote a book on the history of slavery, in the sense that there's all these kind of interlocking stories and layers, right? So you have the stories themselves coming together. That it's a short story that you unravel, but you also have.
People don't have a hot punch out. Sorry.
What?
We're just gonna
We
move.
just did it.
We're just gonna move hashtag access out.
Fire drill.
There's a whole
row of here.
And what I found fascinating about that, and it's a little different from your prior book. I mean, each of the books has a remarkable style. But here, there's a way in which, and I found myself reading this not in a straightforward way. So that there's a whole series of kind of notes and engagements with the historiography in the back of the book, right? That are kind of there, and really remarkable, I think, thoughts and interventions just about the problem of writing about slavery and the problem of slavery. At the same time as there's all these kind of layers of the story that come together, right? And I wonder if part of this was, in some ways, part of it is the traces of you kind of engaging with this material, right, and exploring and traveling through this. At the same time, you pulled together the story in a very compelling way. But I wonder, if that was a conscious layering, if you decided to figure that a way that you really wanted to engage in some of the theoretical historiographical debates, and that's there, how you decided that form, because I think it's really remarkable, and a book that could be read kind of back and forth in all kinds of ways. And that's one thing I just really enjoyed about it.
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of in terms of figuring out the relationship of the literary source and the history, because it's two very different things, right? Melville, if we're thinking about what the moral meanings of each are, right? The event itself. Well, let me back up. Melville's story is not about the Americas. It's about the United States. It's about the crisis that slavery is causing to the Republic in the 1850s, and his wrestling with that problem and his intense pessimism and sense that there is this inescapable impasse in which slavery represents either, there's two options. One, you could fight to end slavery and destroy the promise of the Republic, or you could leave slavery alone and accept the fact that freedom for some means enslavement of others. That's a moral question very particular to the 1850s and Melville, and even Melville's wrestling with it doesn't quite typify other people who compromise and accept, and want and institutionalists who uphold the Fugitive Slave Act and all of that stuff. Melville is very, very particular in Melville. There's that. And then there's the actual historical events, which are a completely different set of questions. It's 50 years earlier. It's slavery in South America for the most part. It's
the age of revolution.
It's the age of revolution rather than the age of rather than the eve of the Civil War. It tells a story of slavery before even the revival of slavery in the South. What we often think of in the United States. It opens up to a whole different set of questions. So what the relationship of those two things were, and so one of the ways I kind of resolve that is by having these interludes, and so I tell the bulk of the story tells those two narratives that I talked about, one of Massa Delano and the other trying to reconstruct as best as possible the journey of the West African. But then interspersed with that is Melville's grappling with the question as a way of, and then figuring out how they intersect at different moments. Then there was just the actual research. I mean, there's a way in which, if one was to set out to write a history of slavery and freedom and the role of deception, not tied to any particular story, where would one start, right? But if you're showing up in Buenos Aires and you're looking at the notary records to try to find the history of a particular group of people, that relieves a lot of pressure, right? That gives you something to do when you show up in Lima, or you're not just researching the big questions, and then but in some ways I've done that almost with, I did that with Last Colonial Massacre, was a history of a massacre and the role of the Communist Party leading to it, and it was the same kind of, for lack of a better word, methodology, where you set out almost to find very mundane questions, and from the research of trying to do that, then it does open up to other things, so that there's a way in which it's made possible by the particularity of the story.
But one of the things it's really skillful, right, is that in the earlier book too, that you tap into a kind of longue durée, very big structural stories, in a way, while you're also focused in on, and this one is a really great example of that, right? So that one does get actually a sense of the story of the transatlantic slave trade at the Age of Revolution and the 19th, all these epochs, right? Because there are these series of epochs that are involved. And I think so, just that, and you do that partly because the interludes, because the moral questions are there, because the story itself is riveting, but it's also a story that's always decentering the center, right? So that you take us to Buenos Aires or the Pacific. So the role of the Pacific in this story. That's
Right.
So this is not only Atlantic, but also Pacific is really interesting.
But it just struck me when you were talking about where do you start and this sort of narrative kind of locates a way to sort of ask these big questions. One of the things that struck me about this book is all the moments that I felt like could also be books, right? I mean, there's that
Sub-books.
Right. I mean, talk a little bit about the sort of sympathetic reaction in upstate New York to the Haitian Revolution in 1783. I'm forgetting the name of the Spanish ship where there's actually a successful revolt. Right?
San Juan Nepomuceno.
Yeah. I mean, you want to talk a little bit about that? I mean, that strikes me as a really kind of interesting moment, right? I mean, that is a sort of counterpoint.
Yeah.
And the sealing cooperative of the Alone, that's an amazing.
We got to get to the seals. That's like a whole other part
Okay,
of
we
the
won't touch
conversation.
sealing, but just that tiny chapter of those guys creating their own mutual list association.
I know the sealing stuff is great. The San Juan Nepomuceno is a fascinating story. So the research went from basically the vast majority, the bulk of what we know about the trial uprising. That's the trial was the name of the ship that Benito Sereno. That's Melville Anglis. I don't even know if it's called anglicizing, but he changes Sereno to Sereno, but he doesn't do it. Actually, Amasa Delano calls Benito Sereno. Calls him Bonito Sereno. But the real Spaniard was called Benito Sereno. He was the captain of a ship called the Trial. In English, it was the Trial because it was a ship that was actually seized from Quakers who were smuggling. So that's that whole story. But
that's exactly my point. You never knew that Quakers smuggled.
But there are documents aside from Amasa Delano's. So Amasa Delano reproduces a lot of the Spanish trial documents related to the trial of the ship. But there was also documents in Madrid and Seville related to this event, and there was one reference. I found one document that talked about this other uprising on a ship, the San Juan Nepomuceno, that left Montevideo in December 1800, and there was an uprising right before it was about to go down the Cape. It was on the way to Peru, and I found only one academic, a Peruvian historian, that has mentioned this, and only in passing, just because I think this Peruvian historian looked at the same document that I found in this one was in Madrid. But this, it must be one of the greatest escapes in the history of Laurent, you would know more about this, but most slave ship uprisings take place close to shore, and what counts as successful is the ship is grounded, maybe they make it to shore, or maybe they establish some degree of autonomy for a few weeks before catastrophe strikes. We do know about the Amistad, we know about the Creole, things like that. San Juan Nepomuceno, it was seized right before it was around Cape. They sailed for 2 months. They reversed the Atlantic Passage. They made it back to Senegal. On the way, they got into 2 battles with Spanish ships. They got into it. They made it to the Cape Verde Islands where they got into a skirmish with the Portuguese battery. They managed to escape from that, and they made it to Senegal, and they made it to I think it was Port St. Louis. Now I can't even remember. Yeah, and they made it at the right moment where there happened to be an interim governor of Port St. Louis who actually wanted to enforce the abolition decree, or like his predecessor and his successor both allowed slavery de facto to continue, even though Napoleon was just about to reinstate it, and they managed to claim their freedom. It's just this remarkable story of this reversal. And the way it relates to the trial, not just because it's an interesting story, is it turns out that the West Africans that led this rebellion were also identified as Muslim by Spanish authorities. And the Spanish viceroy in Peru made a recommendation that it turned out that Spanish officials had been recommending for centuries to stop enslaving Muslims because they bring these perverse ideas to the end. You know, and he doesn't say what those perverse ideas are, but so I use that story as a way to set up the kind of the shadow history of Islam in the American in the history of American slavery, and what the fact that the trial rebels, the fact that they were Muslim, might have played in their rebellion. And a lot of that is, you know, extreme limitation of sources. A lot of it is speculation and just trying, you know, in some ways the paucity of information allowed more of an interpretation. If I knew exactly where the West Africans who led the trial uprising were from, if I knew what kind of Islam they practiced, then that would limit what one could say about it. But because I didn't, and I didn't, you know, I didn't make any, I was clear about what was speculation and what was not, but it does allow for a broader consideration about the question. So anyway, the Sen one that Museno is a fascinating
Well, it's also that the kind. I mean, there are the cases, right, that Ada, where the Haitian Navy captures ships and slaves get liberated
Brings
to
up
Haiti.
the
So there's a few other cases that have basically a happy ending or something.
Right.
Like that.
But I just meant
this
in
is
terms
not
of
dramatic,
across
right?
the
Yeah, no,
Atlantic,
absolutely,
making
right.
it across the Atlantic. I mean, I couldn't find
I
any.
can't think of
I
any.
couldn't find any other.
So there's another book right there. But the Islamic stuff, I think, is really makes it, you know, that insight of the three religions, partly because it's situated historically, right, which is the 1780. I mean, it's not just Islam, but it's the fact that in the late 18th century there are Islamic anti-slavery kind of movements, or movements that are around the problem of Muslims enslaving other Muslims, right?
Yeah,
and in that
something.
sense, it connects with the same kind of abolitionism debates that are going on in Christianity, right? The sort of wrongness of.
Well, and then there's a historian like Manuel Garcia who argues that the political turmoil in West Africa is you know, trying to incorporate in the history of the Atlantic world equal to the French Revolution, equal to the Haitian Revolution, right? If we really don't understand, you know.
But people have actually been quite a little tentative. I mean, West African historians have been really tentative about finding ways that this is being articulated in the Americas. So even in the Haitian context, where it's probably at work to some extent. So that's exciting here to sort of see, because in the context of a trial, of course, is also a good place to think about issues of kind of how you think about law and morality and the morality of certain things, right? Which are obviously
right.
So there. I mean,
well, there's the Bahia, you know, the Bahia uprising is the, you know, and the fact is the classic example of. I mean, in that there's lots of documentation of the role of Islam.
This is the one that Joao wrote about slave rebellion
In
Brazil, where there's
1835, largest urban uprising in the American, largest urban slave rising in the Americans, and it's, you know, and it occurs on the night of power in Ramadan.
There are a couple of of Quranic documents from Haiti too that people have found. So
really?
There's more and more. But anyway, I think that this analysis really pushes that into space.
I want to come back around before we get further into the stories to stick with Laurent's question about the methodology and the layers and stuff, and I especially with the Melville. So, in other words, the methodology may be the same as unfolding in this amazing way. Here's this event, and you can see all these global processes coming together. And you do that beautifully in this book. But I'm really struck, and we talked about this in our globalization seminar, about the status of the literary artifact and the relationship between literature and history. And we talked about the anemic and impoverished way in which historians often deal with literature as evidence and clearly you're not just saying, here was this story, it was based on true facts, now I'm going to come in as the historian and see what really happened. And like one of the things about the interludes, you explained how it was you were dealing with how to manage that, but I just want you to say more, because there's a way in which you remain in dialogue with Melville. Melville continues to hunt the whole, you're not just the story, which is weird because Melville's writing later and the story is from 1804, but your engagement, you're in dialogue with Melville. You're keeping him in the reader's eye. You're letting him speak over and over. you're letting him wander through the aftermaths and afterlives. And then there's this story, which is always there. And never, in a way, I thought this was going to be more about Benito Cereno, the story, and it wasn't, and yet it's always present. And there's something amazing about the kind of, I don't know, and I don't know if you ever resolve it, but there's a kind of regard that you hold for both Melville as someone grappling with these issues, and this story is something that any of us interested in these issues, as well as this history, needs to take very seriously. And in part, I'm also struck by these moments, like you say, it was structured as an epic play, right? It was coming together of these three empires, or these three religions, or the whole, as we talked about on Tuesday, the whole event was a deception. There's something. So throughout, you're also reflecting on the relationship between appearances and reality in what? Capitalism, in imperialism, in slavery, in modern racialization. I'm not sure what, but you seem to be very interested in performance and fiction and ruses and fetish and deception and Melville as someone to kind of, as a formidable interlocutor about these issues, right? You're not just saying like, now let's do the history. So I just want you to linger a little more on the literary, because it was fascinating for me and for many of us.
So Melville. I had read a few things by Melville. I read Moby Dick, and Bartleby, the Scrivener, and maybe the bits of Billy Budd, or I knew that maybe I saw the movie Billy Budd. And Peter Ustinov was that's great.
It's there, a stamp.
Yeah, it's great. It's great, that movie.
Robert Ryan.
I know, it's such a... I dived into Mel, and I was fascinated by the debate around Melville. To put it in stark terms, there seems to be left Melvillians and right Melvillians, right? The left Melvillians want to claim Melville as a critic of empire, a critic of individualism, a critic of slavery, a critic of the industrialization, and the right Melvillians want to point out all that every time you could point to some kind of his skewering of empire expansion, where he seems to endorse it or he seems to celebrate it, and they want to say that his concerns were more metaphysical, his concerns were cosmic. He was obsessed with where one establishes authority in the world of that seems to be individualism unbounded. Where does one as society secularizes with geology and Darwinism, where does one find a moral order? What is the relationship between the surface appearance of things and the metaphysician? How does one in the face of the realization that that the cosmos are empty, how does one deal with the obliteration of the self? All of these things that seem to torture Melville. And I guess the more I thought about them, I just felt like that the debate, but kind of missed the point that all of those. This is just a crude way of claiming him for by superseding the debate and claiming him for the left is all of those things that he was concerned about were about slavery, right? Mm-hmm. The crisis of how does the obliteration of the self in the face of the emptiness of a larger of the larger moral order. That is the crisis of slavery. The ways in which slavery is central to the kind of development of the capitalist ego, which creates the separation between surface and depth, right? That seems to be increasingly drive people crazy trying to figure out the relationship between in the world and the outer world. The Melville's critique of a notion of freedom that was founded on pure individualism, right? Melville had a complicated relationship to slavery. He wrote some really dicey, horrible things after the Civil War. He wrote this essay that was totally reactionary after the Civil War, close to white supremacist. But he still had this critique of American notions of freedom and individualism, which I think one can claim. And I guess I was just trying to transcend that debate, and without necessarily, saying he was a clear-eyed critic of empire or a clear-eyed critic of individualism. He was tortured by the whole thing. I mean, in some ways, his position towards slavery was Camus' position towards colonialism. He didn't know where to come. He didn't know what he was talking about half the time. But he wrestled with that. So trying to get at that wrestling, and again, it's not unlike the question of what the role of Islam was on the trial. Melville didn't leave a lot of documents what he thought. So he has this literary production. There are Melville scholars. There are certain Moby Dick, he wrote quite a bit. His letters to Hawthorne and whatnot. But a lot of stuff Melville didn't. There's not a lot of background information of what he was thinking. There is the text itself, and being able to kind of use that to as the entry point into the moral meaning of the actual history, both to the larger history of slavery in the Americas and then the particular history of slavery for the United States, I think was the way in which I tried to wrestle with the literary.
Can I ask just a quick follow-up
Sure.
question about, when you're saying that, because Camus came to mind to me, Hegel and Susan Buckmore stuff on Hegel and Haiti and Melville, so these people writing, these great writers, writing about concrete forms of domination in literary or abstracted ways that then get taken up as these metaphors and analogies. And usually the move is to say, and it's a good move, which is to say, let's look at, Algerian colonialism. Let's look at slavery in, slavery with respect to Melville. Let's look at the Haitian Revolution with respect to Hegel. These are not metaphors. These are not analogies. This is real. This is concrete. Let's get away from that kind of, as you said, the right even takes it further to, existential questions.
Right.
But one of the things, and I'm used to that kind of suspicion, but part of what I really struck me about the book, about you and Melville, in a way, was I read you as also inviting me, as a reader, inviting us to take seriously the analogy, right? Not just the analogy, but the kind of who ain't a slave, that idea, right? Often it's like, well, Hegel's talking about lords and bondsmen. What about real Haitians who are really enslaved? And that's true, that's truly important, but it struck me that the way Melville moves from the concrete to whether it's metaphorical or analogical, the way wage slavery or indentured, all these degrees of servitude that you talk about, it seemed that the analogy of slavery or the metaphorization or something was actually a useful way to get back into a deep understanding of degrees of freedom and unfreedom and a critique of this kind of either-or simplistic individualist notion of freedom. And
I think
it struck me that in this case the analogy was like, actually, I don't know.
Yeah, because you always come back to the abstract, because you could read Benito Sereno as, it's the only work where Melville is really grappling with slavery as a social institution. And so you could look at that, but then you can never stay on that level, because then it's like, okay, once you get there, okay, so in Moby Dick, Who Ain't a Slave, it's all all fast fish, we're all loose fish. Moby Dick is this hyper symbolic, confusion of symbols and meanings, and then you get to Benito Sereno 4 years later, and it's as concrete as you get in terms of it's literally close to plagiarism. It's about a real event. It's not about slavery as Who Ain't a Slave. It's about the real historical institutions of slavery. But then once you get up to that level, then what's the meaning? Because then you still don't know what Melville meant by telling the story. Right? We still don't know.
And it also becomes a way for you to talk about all those degrees of unfreedom.
Right.
All those gradations.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
The other thing that you do
Until-
is to, oh, sorry.
Yeah, it strikes me to talk about all those degrees of freedom and unfreedom until there's the possibility of monetizing those rebels again. Right? I mean, and that's one of the striking things for me. I mean, so for those of you who don't know the story, right, it's full of spoilers now, right? When Serrano is rescued by Delano and they're back on Delano's ship, there's a debate which plays itself out, and you write about this in really, really interesting ways in court cases for a long time afterwards. But Serrano relinquishes his rights to the ship and says it's lost. And then Delano, and in a way that's not in the story, but you do a great job of sort of talking about Delano's really mutinous crew. Who's kind of had it with him for ill usage, and he's constantly afraid they're going to leave him and abandon him. So he has this barely kind of control of his own ship. And then he says, look, if we reinstate these people, we're all going to profit. And suddenly all these mutinous people that are sick of his complaining about him being an abusive master and this horrendous ways that has made them no money, degrees of freedom and unfreedom are out the window. Right? I mean, and suddenly, those horrendously sharp seal knives are being used against human beings in vicious ways, as we talked about. So it seems to me that that's the moment, right? I mean, where freedom and unfreedom are gone when capitalism is really at stake.
And the way the material. So
I wonder just one last thing, sort of the way in which, because I'm partly interested in it, and this is in some of the stuff that you've written about the ways in which you kind of drawing a distinction between R.A. Ahabs and R.A. Massas, right?
Yeah.
So one of the reasons why it strikes me that those two texts are also different is, again, as you talk about it, Ahab doesn't care about capitalism. Right? Owners, who cares? Right? Owners can complain, I'm going to follow my right now. I'm on this question, it doesn't matter. Right? I don't care if we profit or not. Like, this is what matters. And Amasa is endlessly invested in profit and responsibility.
So let me just try to see if I can tie Gary's comment back to yours, and so just to reference the literary thing and how. So the place where Melville departs from the text and really lets his imagination run wild. So the real Amasa Delano, after the rebellion is put down, after the deception is revealed and the rebellion is put down, and a number of the leaders are killed, and the rest are taken back to Talcahuano, a port city in Chile, and the leaders are put on trial, executed. Some are sent to exile in the south, and the rest are monetized. They're sent on their way to Lima. The real Amasa Delano spends the next year trying to get half the value of the slaves, and he enters into this bitter rivalry with Benito Sereno, which I'll come back and talk to about in a second. That's the real story. Melville changes that. Melville, basically, it's faithful to the whole thing. I mean, except the way he tells it through Amasa Delano, and he embellishes that. But the events, at the moment that the rebellion is put down, and Melville decides to end the story with Amasa Delano consoling a broken Sereno, in a monastery in Peru, and so that rivalry Melville writes out, and it becomes Delano, telling a soon-to-be dead Benito Sereno, why can't you just get over it? Look at the blue sky, feel the trade winds caressing your cheek, listen to the birds singing, and then the literary character Benito Sereno, because they have no memory, because they're not human, and that's a point where Melville could have written the real story. He could have told the story of Amasa Delano chasing Benito Sereno, trying to get his 8,000 pesos or whatever. That would have been interesting. But I think I think what does it mean that he changed it to like this the American innocent trying to tell this old world decadent, about to be dead Spanish captain to just get over it, and why can't you get over it? Why haunts you so much? And then Benito Sereno says, "The Negro." This is a famous quotation that Ralph Ellison uses to begin Invisible Man. So that's a moment where you can't stay on the level of the concrete. So when, in terms of what going back to the actual story and Duncan's question, so these two narratives, so one is the history of, one allows a kind of retelling or telling of the history of slavery during this age of revolution in the Americas, and the other one is Amasa Delano leaving Duxbury and into the world and failing at everything. He's a little bit like a Republican zealot. He's at the beginning of all these, he's in India, he's in Bombay, he's, smoking hashish with Moors in some Philippine island, Jolo. He's in South Africa at the, he's at the Galapagos Island before Darwin is. He's talking about giant turtles. He witnesses the Battle of Saratoga. He's everywhere. He's everywhere. But he can't quite. But it's all. He fails at everything, and he keeps coming back to Duxbury broke. What he's successful at for a very brief period of time is he participates in the first sealing boom in the Pacific. This goes back to something that I know Laurent wanted to talk about. He leads this incredibly successful sealing expedition at the end of the 1700s. We know whaling, right? Whaling was a boom and bust, but sealing was like whaling concentrated. It really was the United States' first boom and bust resource extraction outside its borders for a very short period of time. New England is headed into the Pacific, and they, there were millions of seals, rookeries on island after island, and they were bringing them mostly to China, where they were trading them for porcelain and spices and whatnot. But what begins to happen in an unbelievably short period of time is that the price of seals skins start to collapse in China because there's just too many. They're piled on the docks, they're rotting in the rain, the pelts of the furs. And that leads the sealers to escalate the killing. And so what you have happening within like a 3-year period after this moment of enormous riches and profits is you have collapsing prices and extinction going hand in hand, where literally on island after island seals were disappearing. I mean, I think biologists and historical biologists whatnot think that we've lost whole subspecies of seals during this period. Delano is there for the boom, and he's living a kind of captain's life that as a child of the American Revolution, who did everything that his pastors in Duxbury told him to do. He read, and he learned how to to think about things, and he learned how to use his passions, and use his reason and his virtues to govern his passions and to self-governance, and it was finally paying off. He was part of a kind of consortium of seal ship captains that did quite well during the first expedition. By the time he comes out on his second expedition, the seals are gone. There's no more seals left. And first he winds up in Tasmania, Bass Strait, the strait that separates Australia from Tasmania. You see, he has the seals there. There's no seals there. There's no seals there. He gets into these pitched battles with British sealers. His crew jumps ship. He's forced to take on these escaped convicts from British penal colonies in Hobart. So then he sails back to Chile because he heard maybe the seals back in Masafuera and those islands off of Chile. And now he's got a ship full of white convicts that are rebelling, that are testing his authority. He's relying more and more on physical punishment in order to maintain discipline. There's no seals left off the coast of Chile. His men are on the point of desertion, and that's when he encounters the trial. And part of his rally, once the deception is revealed, and he goes back to his ship and he rallies his men to put down the rebellion. This is the moment where race and white supremacy really kind of merge into this condensed moment of race terror, and it's also the moment where these two, the environmental exploitation goes head on to the racial exploitation of slavery. These two systems, and you see kind of how they come together, and then part of the reason why Delano spends the next year trying to get half the value of the slaves, despite his Republican principles, because he does seem to be opposed to slavery. And opposed to all forms of arbitrary power. He was opposed to privateering and whatnot. was because his voyage was a bust, and he needed the money in order to keep this crew.
I mean, yeah, I came in here wanting to talk about the seals in part because but your depiction of the sealing culture is such a brilliant kind of microcosm of, right, of kind of the brutality of capitalism, the violence, the descriptions of the violence, the seals as characters, right? Because you do have the seal that actually kills a sailor, and the mother seal. You know what I mean? There are these. I don't know what this says about me, but I remember the seals. But because it's a kind of, but also a kind of microcosm of certain kinds of resistance, right? And then the people who sort of set up, there are these people who set up their homes in the bones of whales, right, on these islands, and the kind of layers of exploitation. But I thought it was a quite brilliant move in the sense that a lot of times, you know, when you're writing about the history of slavery, it's kind of too much, right? Or you're writing the history of capitalism, environmental destruction. And here it all comes to bear on a very specific intersection, right? And the kind of exploitation of nature, the violence of killing the seals themselves. Yeah. And then, of course, that's also a prelude to the larger story, but it's almost as if you kind of begin to understand the way that this sort of exploitation in capitalism, what it was doing to human beings, right, all along, all through this thing, through the kind of story of the animals. I don't know if this was intentional, but I felt like that was a really interesting move. There's a film like Amir Costa Rica film that begins with like a bombing of a zoo.
Oh,
you know, and it's like a depiction. It's like a depiction of war, but through the bombing of a zoo, and somehow it's more horrible to watch than if it was a bombing of a city for some reason in a way because it's unsettling in a way. So. But I thought that the other thing I wanted to say was that about the kind of, there's this great sort of, if you want to start somewhere, the note on the sources and other matters, which is so kind of modestly things, which has like categories like slavery and freedom, and then my favorite, which is there's one that's like, yeah, it's like slavery and freedom, there's Haiti and freedom, but then there's one that says Pablo Neruda, John Huston, Paul Newman, and I Spy, which is this little trajectory. But it's really amazing. But I love this section in a way because it was like you were grappling with these things. And I feel like one of the answers to the question for you is that, so Melville is dealing with metaphysical problems, but so are all the characters in this. And I thought that's kind of why it works. In other words, so the Muslim slaves on the ship, I mean, I think are rendered in such a way that, of course, they are also dealing with metaphysical theological problems, right? I mean, it's not as if they're less engaged with the problem of abstract relationship to God, morality, fellow beings, and so forth.
Justice,
and justice, and in the same way, I mean, and then you yourself engage with it too in a certain way. So I think that's where, so that the literary and historical break down because all of the historical actors are themselves, you know, are engaged in abstract or metaphysical problems and in material things at the same time. So there's not a
performance.
Right, and so Melville, right, and that's I think very important. So Melville isn't here held up as a kind of the abstract thinker or literary. He's embedded in a sense of web of people grappling with the great problems of the moment.
Yeah.
What about Duncan's other point about, which, you know, in a lot of the follow-up articles you wrote in the press and stuff, where you keep reminding us, this is the coda to the nice description of the sealing violence you guys just described when you said we have to worry about the Amalthus. It's not the Ahabs. It's not the, you know.
Well, this is, you know, because
I think it's a really important point in the book and in the conversation around the book. Sorry.
So one way people have read. There's different ways of reading Ahab. One could actually see him as an anti-hero, as fighting against instrumental rationality and capitalist reason, but he's often read as this kind of you know, one reading of Melville is that he's anti-totalitarian. Ahab as embodying a kind of modern totalitarianism. He's some fusion of Stalin and Hitler. You know, he's able to kind of pull his men into his emotional thrall and against the kind of economic interests of the Nantucket owners of the Pequod, you know, drive his men into this destructive catastrophe, this pursuit of the white whale, and you know, people kind of like that reading of Ahab. I mean, you know, it's you know, Edward Said described George Bush as that, you know, going after Saddam Hussein. Oliver Stone has a reference to Ahab in Platoon, you know, trying to explain Vietnam as you know, the insanity of the American empire. you know, in some ways that kind of lets people off the hook because, you know, we're much more like Amasa than we are Ahab, right? Amasa is the person who follows the rules, who you know, who doesn't, you know, he's not a you know, exception. He's not a rebel against, you know, against modernity. He really is a kind of product in some ways, and he's caught. You know, he he rallies his men not through this kind of emotional. You know, he's caught in the much more mundane, you know, crisis driven by ecological collapse and the crisis of supply and demand, and that's what is the motor of the race terror that he unleashes, right? It's not some more kind of, you know, Promethean, Ahabian, you know, that's going to be the end. It's, you know, it's the much more mundane resource.
Insurance policy.
Yeah.
Like,
Oh,
then
there's
I'm against
insurance.
slavery, but we have an insurance
Yeah,
policy.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly, right? It's like, here's someone who's made a career, right, out of not sort of transporting fish to the Caribbean and being involved in.
Yeah, you seem to be
Not transporting slaves across the Atlantic, and then in that very kind of quotidian, all too familiar, all too haunting way, you know, someone who imagines he's not racist, right? I mean, who imagines that this is about justice. He can't see the structural inequalities in front of him.
And he comes back to the United States. What's fascinating about the story, it's a kind of coda to the story. He's on this voyage with his brother Samuel. There's two, after the first successful sealing voyage, they build a second ship, the Pilgrim, to join Amasa's ship, the Perseverance, and you know that makes it even worse because now they have two ships to support. There's no seals, you know, and they both come back to the United States, and this, in some ways, is very representative of the, you know, there's two, again, in very stark ways. There's two reactions to the people's being involved in race terror outside the borders. One is that you come back even more committed to the project. You know, the new right? You know, and Samuel, Amasa's brother, comes back and he doubles down on Christianity. He becomes a participant in the Second Great Awakening. He writes these, you know, he gives up that optimistic Christianity of his youth that thought that bliss and perfection were possible and embraces this brimstone version of Christ. And Amasa Delano goes in the opposite direction, not to, you know, by no means to absolve anything, you know, to turn him, but he becomes, he comes back and he's broke and he never pulls himself out of debt. He probably winds up in debtor's prison. That's one of the reasons why he writes his memoir. He can't quite make it. He can never make it work. He dies completely destitute. He becomes increasingly more jaundiced about it all, right? Where he writes these letters to his born-again brother about, you know, condemning Christianity. You know, I wouldn't abolish Christianity because that's the religion of our fathers, but when you look at everything bad done to you, it was Christians that did it, you know, and so these letters that are just totally, you know, completely, you know, that early kind of pluralism that he had, or tolerance, degenerated into this skepticism and this jaundiced skepticism of, you know, so there's you know, the two responses, right? The Amasa Delano comes back after participating in race violence beyond the borders and rejects the whole thing, and his brother comes back and he's ever more committed. And Amasa Delano dies completely, you know, broke. I found his probate will in Boston. He dies. The sum total of his property was a 50-cent used hammock, a 50-cent old pine writing desk, and 700 unsold copies of his memoir. So you had you know, an artifact of his writing life, an artifact of his sealing life, and the unsold sum of both. You know, so so
It's a bright future.
Maybe we should open it up. I think it's just a little,
Sure.
7:15. So,
Why don't we collect some
Green Trust of the
questions and take a few at a time? Yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
well, I'm interested a little bit on part of the title, right? Empire of Necessity. You were talking earlier about the idea of necessity and liberty, I believe.
freedom and
Of
necessity,
freedom
liberty.
and necessity. So I don't know if you can expand a little bit on the
So-
idea behind the title and
So,
what terms mean.
so Melville has this other story that he published in Putnam's Monthly right before Benito Cereno called The Bell Tower, and he has 3 epigrams to that story that he attributes to an anonymous author whose manuscript is in my possession. Melville scholars think that he just wrote them and made them up. But the Empire of Necessity is the epigram to the bell tower is seeking to conquer a larger liberty, man but extends the empire of necessity. It's a very Hegelian, that we think that we're going to be able to escape and skip off into some realm of freedom, but we're constantly being drawn back into the dependencies, and I think that's a very, I think there's a kind of, in any case, it's an indication of Melville's understanding, criticism of a kind of fetishized notion of freedom and individualism, right? That you can only really achieve freedom by recognizing your unfreedom, by recognizing the necessity, right? And I think that goes to the heart of Melville's critique of Americanism.
It occurred to me while I was listening to these great talks. It was really interesting and really grateful for it. But about the claims of history and historiography over against narrative and literary, that in a certain way Melville kind of preemptively meditates on just that question in the form of Benito Cereno itself in the following way. Narrative happens, and then at a certain point there is a transcript gleaned at trial after everyone is returned to shore. And there's a long transcript in different kind of formal language about just all the facts of the case that were, it's kind of his version of a little historiographic narrative of the tale he's just told us. And it's kind of behind the scenes facts and so forth. And then, if you recall, when that transcript is over, there's this interesting but very odd little piece of language that goes, if the foregoing, by which he means the transcript, if this function, if this be the key that unlocks the narrative of the foregoing, that is the story he just told you, then the hull of the San Dominick lies open today. And then he just goes on with the end of the story, and there's a couple more pages, and that's the end of the story. But it's always seemed to me that the subjunctive form of that thing, there's nothing at all revealed by that transcript. In other words, the claims of history and historiography are null and void, as opposed to the claims of literary that Melville has generated out of this. So, so that is that's one of the, among the many other indications of the tale itself. That's one of the thrusts of the tale itself. So what does that do to, I don't want to put this too subversive, but what does that do to a later historian, or like all of us interested in the claims of history, come along 150 years later and want to put together a history based on these facts, when Melville has cast more than a gimlet eye on the claims of history within the confines of the tale itself.
Can I just say, because I was thinking along the same lines of Alejo Carpentier's book, Siglas Luces, which does similar work in a certain way, right? Which was based on Victor Hughes and a kind of particular, has a very similar arc. And he later in an interview described how after writing the novel, one of the descendants of Victor Hughes came to him and said, well, how did you know about Sophie, I think, there's a kind of love affair in the book. How did you know about that, right? And he sort of says, oh, I just made that up, but it turned out to be true. It turned out that she was saying, oh, no, there was that story passed in my family. Right, so there's a kind of, I just think it's really interesting because I think there's a series of novels that really work to kind of undermine this, and it's great that Melville, but I also feel like you wrote in a way that was sensitive to, there's something in the book where there's a vertiginous, in Greg's book, there's a vertiginous quality to the narrative that is, no, but I think that's good. That's unsettling in the sense that it's not, that's why it doesn't feel to me, it feels like at once a history and a kind of critique of the construction of history in a really interesting way.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I miss my Eric a little bit. I mean, I think one of the ways in which you're sensitive to that is really, kind of, and it's not something that a lot of literary critics have done, have looked at it, but really looking at it, at Delano's narrative very suspiciously.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, so reading the whole thing and not just this section, right? And sort of talking to there's a kind of point, where you sort of talk about how self-obsessed he is, right? And in this kind of, in his narrative voice, right?
Delano.
Yeah. I mean, and so there's a way in which, like, every piece of evidence is given the same kind of suspicious attention as a crafted document, right? That has a particular kind of agenda.
Right, his narrative is as much a kind of artifact of that kind of Christianity at that moment and his performance of who he is, as opposed to this is just, and show he can't possibly know the truth of what he was part of, which changes the whole historiographic impulse. Oh, I found the diary, I found the truth, I found what really happened, and you're like, if we think systemically about this in terms of these big processes and systems of structure, he has no idea what.
No, and that's the point of that thing. I mean, if you read the whole memoir, it's like he offers it as a classic Enlightenment encyclopedia of knowledge. He says, he writes a letter to, I think it was John Quincy Adams, or one of the Adamses, is he wants a blurb. And he literally wants him to say something nice, favorable about it. And this is the Secretary of State, I guess it was John Quincy Adams, I can't remember, I have to check. And Adams, Adams tactfully declines. But he, in Delano's letter, he says, I hope to contribute to the world's store of knowledge. And, but of course the whole thing is about the impossibility of knowledge. And, it's the constant, it's a whole, the memoir is it's one deception after another. It starts with this deception of not being, trying to trick his crew into what's great about I want to come back to the point you were making, but let me just say, look, if you read Delano's memoir, the very first story he tells, because he doesn't tell his life story in chronology. It's all, it's kind of all over the place, and you've got to kind of piece it together and figure out what he's talking about. He starts with this attempt he starts off by complaining how superstitious sailors are. That even though they live by, observation of the natural world, they are totally enthralled to the idea of the supernatural, and how one time he tried to trick his crew into the world of reason. He strung up a ghost, a ghost from the yard arm or whatever, and he thought he would, point it out, and then when they all got scared, he would show them that, oh, it's not really a ghost. But they got so scared and terrified that he couldn't bring himself. I mean, he was undone by his own trick, right? And so he couldn't. He wound up not being able to tell his crew that there wasn't really a ghost, that he's the one who did it. And the whole memoir is one thing after another like that. And it's just the impossibility. I mean, it's like nonsense, but I agree with. I don't have any absolutist commitment to history writing in terms of what it's epistemological truth. I mean, we know the limits of what we write, what the documents. I think you just try to write that doubt into it, while at the same time, be able to kind of make an argument, a moral argument, a historical argument that and write the the limits of that some way into it either.
You've used the word moral twice now, and I'm interested, twice, but that's two more than many other talks you'll go to, and I'm just curious about your thoughts about the moral sort of responsibilities of the scholar in history or some other discipline.
Well, same thing. I don't have any grand, grand framework, but I think that the whole point of doing it is to have some kind of an argument and have some kind of ethical stake in what you're writing and what the point of it is in terms of the present. And I think the more that you kind of write that political commitment into what you're writing, the more interesting it is, because at least you know that. I mean, while keeping all the doubts present. We're writing about you're writing about slavery and race. I mean, obviously it has a bearing on the present.
I mean, that too, I mean, I pushed this a little bit more on Tuesday in the kind of previous discussion we had in globalization about this, but I mean, it strikes me that that's, particularly in the writing you did about this project in the nation. And so the end of one of those pieces is, they're still with us or Amasis. They have knowledge of their duty and are disposed faithfully to follow its dictates, even unto the ends of the earth. You know, and it struck me that is all too hauntingly familiar, right? If one wants to think about Darrell Wilson, or one wants to think about George Zimmerman, or one wants to think about any other, unfortunate, endless series of violence against black bodies, in a very similar kind of way, right? I mean, so that struck me as a kind of, particularly in the writing you did in The Nation and in the New York Times about this project. Not that it's not in the project, but I think those sort of ancillary pieces that you did really are kind of haunting for how, what the difference between the kind of quotidian, horrendous violence of Amasis all around us, right? The blindness of not being able to see the structural situations, the structural inequalities that have caused the situation that they're in. Right? True of all those sailors too, who are as mutinous against their, punishing master as the people on board the trial are. And yet how that all flips with this kind of notion of duty. And a duty that's fueled by capitalism. It seems to me.
Yeah, I mean, but there's the more general point is writing in a way that draws out what's at stake. Is what I think is interesting. I mean, and then more specifically is going back to the question of American exceptionalism and this. I find most compelling the kind of writers who are trying to grapple with what seems to be the kind of quicksilver nature of American ideology, how it can keep on reproducing itself and keep reproducing its own blindness, and obviously Abbasi Delano as a particularly strong example of a certain kind of idiocy that can't see the social world around them. Trying to understand what the origins of that blindness is. The way it relates to larger scholarly interests. I am more interested in the ideology, how the ideology reproduces itself. Why do we have to keep on telling it?
It's not just him. I mean, you also, and I'm sure other historians do this as well, but one of the things that comes out of the book so nicely is how much the anti-slavery, so-called anti-slavery New England economy depends at every turn, and all these families and fortunes, and so much is totally invested in and dependent upon the whole slave system, but in a way that allows them to distance themselves.
Right.
I'm struck, I'm a sociologist, and I'm struck by the idea that these people involved in the story, and even Malcolm himself, what's coming up in the conversation is how the society and the structure of how slavery organized what the people do is really kind of separate and a pressure upon what they actually do and the choices they make. But, from what I've read of your work, it seems that you're saying actually the individual actions are more a reflection of society, but in this conversation it seems like the individuals are being, they're in a system and they cannot really see the system that they're in. But I teach my students that, racism is not this thing that happens in society. Society is us, and it's all the decisions we make every day. And so I'd really like you to speak to this, as particularly because these people are on a ship. It's this box that's floating on the ocean. You can make your own decisions about what your life literally is like, because you're detached from government and lands and laws. You're on the ship with a crew. you encounter some people that you can decide, I'll let them pass. When the ruse comes clean and, you know, you can decide. I'm looking at a bunch of human beings, and if I pretend I didn't see them, I let them go. And then I don't end up in debtor's prison, maybe. Or, you know, they have choices. And the discussion seems to be as if people don't have them. So I just wanted you to talk about that.
Yeah, that raises a lot of different questions, right? The way in which the work is, you know, the story itself is really proxy for making larger arguments about structure and to what degree that, you know, but then there's the actual question about to what degree the individuals have choices in any given situation. I mean, in terms of a ship, I don't know if that, I mean, being on a ship is probably one of the least free places to be. I mean, it's, you know, there's the hierarchy of the crew. There's the debt relations that are involved on every level. I mean, it's pretty. There's you know, there are these efforts to carve out places of freedom, going back to the, you know, the sealing. The system of sealing was in some ways much more brutal and much more, you know, whaling. You know, Melville has these great descriptions of whaling as being proto-democratic, or, you know, it's people coming together and working the ship and integrating their labor, and there's something kind of sublime in that, people of all races coming together. Sealing was the opposite. Sealing reproduces the isolation of settler colonialism. The crews were dropped on these islands. You know, they were left for years at a time. The amount of time that they were left on the island depended on how many seals were there. As the seal population collapsed, the stints on the island went longer and longer. There was increasing fighting among crews. The pressure that was brought to bear on crews and on captains as a result of declining prices. I don't know how much freedom and choice one has in a system like that. I mean, sure, there are moral decisions that people make, and you shouldn't lose that realm of freedom that exists. But there is this world of necessity, and that conditions. You know, if prices are collapsing and you're trying to make up the margin by killing more seals, but there are no seals left to kill, and your crew is, you know, then the only place literally you know, it's almost the only place to make up the margin was by exploiting people more and more and leaving them on the island more and more, and then the violence that involved in that. I mean, we could say that people had freedom, but the logic constraints in which they operate, I think you can discern a pattern to that, and you can index it to larger structures and larger social relations. Right? But it's a good question to what degree people. It goes back to the heart of freedom and necessity.
It also seems one of the differentiating when you say varying degrees of freedom, when you have the Western Enlightenment conception of freedom as something that's extensive and expansive and always related to space, like in Kant, it's the stars are the limit, and versus a negative, like, you know, my private space is the limit, and I have a right not to be violated in that, and that would be a different conception of freedom that would take away from that expansionist thing. I mean, that's what I only read the parts we had read for the seminar, but that the delusion is that the freedom is in the expansion, and that the paradox or the perversion is that this totally entails violating the personal space of people. And so that seems to me an interesting paradox that I just got.
The illusion of expansion, I don't know what you mean
well, all
by
that
the illusion of expansion.
Describe, all that, I mean, freedom is usually associated with movement,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, well, seeking the conduct
move,
a larger liberty sounds...
Right, and then, but I'm sorry, yeah, right, exactly, it's impetuous, it's sort of this strange, disturbing sense of all over the place, as opposed to a sense of freedom that's limited by, you know, the individual next to you when you start out talking about Latin American democracies and the
Well, a recognition of
The
necessity,
recognition of other
independency,
people,
and
yeah.
recognition of
Yeah, yeah.
society.
It just, go ahead. I want to go back to a question, but go ahead.
You should then. I'll follow up.
Okay. I mean, so, I mean, I do think that's a great question. And so part of what interests me about this book and about Melville and about these figures, right, is, you know, in his own narration, right, reading his own memoir, Delano, and Melville's version of him, he imagines that he's not racist, right? But he is so deeply enmeshed in a racist structure, right, that I'm interested in how do those two things exist at the same time, right? And the justification, I mean, right?
But doesn't that, I mean,
But-
we talk about colorblind racism, it still exists.
Exactly.
All the.
No, I think,
yeah.
exactly, right? Exactly, exactly, right? And
Yeah.
that, I think that is the urgency for me to think about this, right? So, and the rationale that he uses is duty, right? Is essentially, I'm doing the just thing by carrying out my duty. And that's what I mean about it being so hauntingly familiar, right? And why it reminds me of Wilson and Zimmerman, right? Because it is all too horrifyingly familiar, right? The way in which people imagine, you know, they cannot see the structure that they inhabit, right? As shaping all of the movements that they're involved in, right? And then at the same time they can say, but I'm not racist, right? And so I was just doing my duty, right? And so that you know, that failure goes back to 1855, it goes back to 1805. Why can't we have a different kind of imagination that allows us to think about, I mean, so one of the things that I thought about in terms of reading this is one of the most, I think, 3 or 4, probably 5 most familiarly taught US pieces of fiction, right? Why isn't it doing the work with our students that it should be, right? And so, sorry, yeah, just, I mean, yeah, I'm not saying it doesn't in every instance, right? But why isn't it changing the way in which, right, we imagine the relationship of personal responsibility and structural racism? And
Can I just?
Sure.
Yeah, it's like, I feel that exactly what you're talking about, for example, in the responses of Darren Wilson, who has no remorse whatsoever, who's carrying out his duty, and the police officer, I don't know his name, who did the chokehold on Eric Garner, who has complete remorse, but they both end up killing someone. And it's, yeah, it's a shame that they both end up in the same place with seemingly very different souls about what is the result of being in the systematic
But
pattern.
doesn't that
Yeah, there you go.
negate what you said, what
I
you're saying
don't
about
think
it,
it
about
negates
freedom,
it.
about freedom, about?
No, I do, okay. So, however, I think, for example, remorse is a choice. It is a choice. So now that officer who sees what happened, I think he would have made a different choice had he realized that I can't breathe means you're killing me. And I can only imagine that the killer of Michael Brown is never, ever going to rethink his position. So, you know, although we do have similar results, I do think that there's a different kind of thought. Same thing with, you know, I see the way Barack Obama is giving very measured political speeches, and his discourse sounds to me very different than the mayor, who's, you know, who has such nuance and like, no, I'm not going to take any questions. This is a shame, and we should just think about it. Goodbye. You know, and I do think that we are all in a system, but you have choices. And last thing, I even have trouble with the idea of sealing as no choice. If all of the seals are being wiped out, and you can see this happening because you're traveling the world and they're not there anymore, at what point do you say, holy crap, these were living things And why am I putting human life above these things? And people have, you know, Jane Goodall lived with animals. Like, people do live with animals and then figure out that we're all animals on this ship that is the Earth. And some people never figure it out to their own demise. They'll kill them all. So that's all I'm going to say. Sorry. Thank you.
I don't know, I'm just thinking about, this is different from where you've been, but the role of the imagination, right? You're saying this is, Benito Cereno is one of the well-taught texts. How come it hasn't had an impact? But the question that I teach it all the time in a literature course, looking at slavery, using Uncle Tom's Cabin, using slave narratives from the 1850s, using some of what are referred to as the sentimental women writers, and Hawthorne, looking at the, you know, the invasion of people's interiority and souls and all this. My students at York College often do not know how to read Benito Cereno, right?
It's
they
hard.
don't see, right.
It's hard.
So I'm not a Melville scholar, right? So I haven't read, and I wanted to ask you, what do you make of Melville's use of indirection in terms of looking at this as a text that really is interrogating these metaphysical questions, which we all are having delight in sitting here talking about, but in terms of really fostering political change, if you put Benito Cereno up against Harriet Jacobson's Life of a Slave Girl, or Douglas, or Uncle Tom's Cabin, you have a very different response. So just historically, in terms of the use of the indirection and, you know, the play of the imagination compared, that's one. And I think it's about, you know, interpretation and what the, when I read all those texts together, when I do this course, I mean, I always come up against, I love Melville. How can you not? You know, how can you not love Melville? But I think that Melville was more concerned with his own kind of play, you know, his own thinking than he was really with trying to enact real change in the world.
Oh, I would agree. Yeah, I mean, I guess that was the point I was trying to get beyond. I think that, yeah, he was obsessed about all of these. He was obsessed about himself. He was obsessed, but I think all of those obsessions in some ways are related to slavery. I think that's the point, because slavery, how can you, I mean, if you're obsessed about whether the, you know, about the role of the individual in larger moral order, how is that not about slavery, right? I mean, how is that not, you know, for centuries upon centuries of millions of people, the metaphysical crisis of the 19th century, even if it wasn't discussed about in terms of slavery, was about slavery. I think. I mean, that's what.
Who's his audience?
Well, nobody. There's nobody. He was his audience was himself. But that's it. See, this is, you know,
we are.
This is where I'm more.
Right.
This is ultimately where I'm more. You know, I mean, I don't know what to say about the. You know, the way I like thinking about. When I was doing this, I like comparing Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin with Benito Cereno. It's almost a perfect. I mean, you know, nobody read Melville. You know, and he was this sentimental woman writer that became an international bestseller. I mean, you know, he wanted to be the consciousness of the United States, and here was this, you know, and just the contrast between the depictions of slave life. I mean, the whole Harriet Beecher Stowe makes her case on presenting slaves as Christ-like innocents. What you saw on the outside was what there was on the inside. Right. But Melville writes, you know, Babbo, what, you know, it's all about deflection and you know, it's all about, you know, getting, you know, that kind of severance between interior life and exterior life. But I think that severance is, you know, I think capitalism is a massive project of ego formation, and I think slavery was central to the creation of capitalism. I think that would be the two-sentence way of saying it.
And I think I would just add to that I mean, I think that I disagree with Greg about Benito Cereno being about the United States. I mean, I think that the revisions that Melville makes to Delano's narrative are very pointed in trying to suggest that slavery is the new world condition, right? And that capitalism and slavery go together. I mean, and so renaming the ship, the figurehead is Christopher Columbus, right? The inscription of "Follow your leader." I mean, it seems to me that what Melville is trying to argue out in Benito Cereno is that slavery and capitalism are the new world condition, right? And for him, that's not.
So you're a left Melvillian?
Probably. Where I left Melville, probably. That's probably fairly accurate. And so it seems to me that he's not interested in. He's not writing for the same reason that Harry Jacobs is or Harry Beecher Stowe is. Right? I mean, I don't think he has the same commitment to anti-slavery that they do, for one. Right? But he's really trying to look at a sort of systemic issue that he's saying goes back to the first entry into the New World. Right? Now, this is what this has been. It's been about capitalism and slavery. Right? And I think all of those revisions of Delano's actual narrative are meant to bring that out.
I keep thinking of Marcus Rediker once. It was on a commission for an exhibit of a ship that was a pirate ship, the Ouida, right? Which became a big issue because it turned out that the ship was actually a slave ship that pirates had taken, right? So in other words, when they tried to do an exhibit about piracy, and then in Tampa, the African American community said, well, this is actually a slave ship, right? There's, but in this whole debate about we were on a commission, he sort of said, the thing is, people think there's two ships in American history, right? There's the ship that's freedom, essentially. There's the ship that's like the kind of Delano's vision, right? That you fulfill your freedom by going on the ship, right? And then there's, of course, the slave ship, right? And he's like, the problem is it's the same ship, right? And that's like the fundamental problem. And that's the story here, right? We keep coming back to this is the same, it's the same ship, right? There aren't two ships.
It's a ship that's owned by 5 or 6 empires.
Right, and it's the same ship, not just in the United States, it's the ship of whatever, the modern world, or however you, and that we keep returning to that. And obviously the ship was, it doesn't mean that everybody relates to the ship in the same way and so forth, but and so in that sense the ship is, and I think that as, going back to Edmund Morgan, or so many generations of historians now, it's Baptists, it's sort of the same thing, that there's a kind of, the problem is, it's really hard to admit that it's the same ship and draw out the consequences, from that era to Gardner being, to these things, and that's the problem that, the nub of the problem that, but it does seem like, and it's a very real daily problem as well as a fundamental philosophical problem at the same time.
And you see that so clearly with Delano, who is, one of the amazing things is when I think of it's not my field, it's not anything I know about, but so I have stereotypical notions of early modern commerce, capitalism. I think of bills of sales and the giant merchant companies and kind of like, and the contingency, the risk, the kind of wild uncertainty, and this idea of the same ship that literally, like, you strike out and you've got pork, and then you've got white indentured servants, and then you have slaves, and then you have skins, and then there's a kind of, it really is one giant game, and you throw yourself into it. Doesn't mean that you don't have choices along the way, but by following his itinerary, you get a different, you get this idea that it is literally one ship. Not just like this is the same system or something, but
try to understand not just that it's the same ship, but how slavery makes
it's all interconnected.
The freedom possible in all sorts of ways. Generates the wealth which generalizes notions of distinction, of self-creation, of and all of that stuff is the way liberty is created out of slavery, and the way what is American exceptionalism is the refusal to understand how individual supremacy is white supremacy. That's what it comes down to. Individual supremacy is white supremacy in this country, just disguised, but often not disguised.
And that seems to be really clear in the way in which you write about the actual rebellion and the paper that they asked Benito Cereno to sign. So that's drawn up in Arabic
that's amazing.
And so they imagine,
in their own language, I think they said. Well, they knew how to speak in their own language, and then they.
But you write that as they're, you know, they're kind of imagining that they've entered into a kind of contract.
Right.
Right.
They can
And
make
you're going to
some.
be
That's that,
transported
right. Yeah.
to a place of freedom, right? And,
Right.
and then that's the one contract that you know, can't be maintained.
Right,
So,
right, right.
But it's interesting to sort of, you know, to see their desire to kind of, wasn't that interesting? You know, their desire to kind of enter into their understanding of capital relations, right? If there's a contract, if there's some sort of agreement, you know, we've
Yeah,
reached a new
I
understanding.
mean, you know, this goes
Contract,
to the limits of
constitution.
this goes to the limits of the sources, right? The Spaniards said that they drew up a contract, they drew up a piece of paper, they made them sign it, they knew how to speak in their own language, then from there, then there's a lot of speculation about their familiarity with maritime law, to what degree, trying to think about the way the sources of their deception might actually be rooted in a culture of literacy and theology, rather than how historians often talk about the folkloric origins of deception, Brian Rabbit, just trying to think about, maybe Babo and Maury actually came from a society not only that was literate, but that in which slavery was a moral question that was theologically debated, for centuries, and how that played out, and that's pure
But also the elaborate forms of freedom and unfreedom, right? So it's not, that's also the point, right? In the West African context, it's not, it's not either that's sort of chattel slavery, it's that there was all kinds of very complex, complicated relationships, right?
And in some ways, go back to the question, the moral standpoint, which is that, Melville and Islam in some ways are the moral standpoints of the critique, right? Because Melville and Islam are fully aware of the ways in which
This is the country.
slavery, necessity, and freedom are you can't
Something
they're related.
very interesting came out in that Jacobin interview you gave, linked to these degrees of unfreedom. So on the one hand, as you're saying, kind of individual liberty is based on it is white supremacy, it's based on this kind of opposition to freedom. But I'm also thinking of your interest in the idiocy of, right, as you put it, the kind of Western/American ideologies of liberty. And if I read that interview correctly, part of what was coming out between you and the questioner was the way in which the existence of slavery actually has led to a very impoverished notion of, a liberal notion of freedom. That the real existence of real chattel slavery means that there's this fiction that if one isn't a slave, one is free. And clearly there's an ontological difference between being a slave and not being a slave, and yet does that mean one is free? And Melville, in these degrees of unfreedom, is very, very interested in all these forms of domination. Who ain't a slave isn't just the kind of the bad faith of the non-slave who can say, who ain't a slave? It's not just trivializing slavery, it's saying, look, not being a slave doesn't mean one is free, right?
And there's a link in the sense that, sorry, it's a sort of, that in the Economist, when the Economist reviewed Ed Baptist's book, right, and then it was removed, there was on Twitter the Economist book reviews hashtag, which was funny. But then we sort of discovered that there was this little genealogy of that.
But it's your book too.
It was your book, yeah, exactly. So the same, there was like the 3 reviews of books about slavery, all of which, by the Economist, all of which basically said the books were not nice enough to white people. I mean, that was essentially the kind of main in the case of the Haiti book, it was like, it's too bad that the Haitian Revolution made Haitians so incapable of understanding that only wage labor can run out.
Right, yeah.
In your case, it's sort of like, well, the villains,
there were no heroes.
Only the Ed Baptist book was removed, actually. I didn't get that one. But there is a really interesting story. I mean, behind that, and people have analyzed this, that the Economist does. If you are in the church of neoliberalism, right, and the point is that freedom has to be the fact of not being slavery, you have a problem with this history, right? It's like somehow, so they go a little crazy and they can't quite, they can't really be this, right, in some ways. There's got to be some way in which to redeem. So I thought it's kind of intriguing, right, that you can see there too the difficulty that actually, which is another reason the politics are in the book, that forcing people to confront this is precisely what we have to do, right? Because they have to be, the out shouldn't be there.
Right.
So.
get a bad review from The Economist.
That's the. They're often not bad reviews. They just say.
No, right. But they're sort of.
They're just like, yeah, but.
I want to read, it sounds like we're about to end. We can't end this without talking about James, C.L.R. James on Melville.
You're opening that up at 7:55.
I just want to read a quote which goes back to this question of the morality, Eric's question about the politics, this question of whether Melville is interested in changing, transforming things or not, or the metaphysical. And James took Melville very, very seriously. He writes about Moby Dick and not about this. But he's got this great quote about Moby Dick where he says, Melville sees no solution to the problem of society, but he does not say there is none. He can see none. Moby Dick is a baffled, defeated, but not a hopeless book. And there's a way in which, there's the question of what Melville really wanted to do, what his politics were, what his commitments were, but there's also what these texts are able to do. And for James, he almost didn't care what Melville as the guy was doing, but he's saying, like, he was able to see, he saw things about these changing epochs, the end of one era and the beginning of another, the decline of the Spanish, as it comes out here, these different kinds of individualism. He's able to see the Amasa as this horrifying future, and there's a way in which these texts show us something, and we can now, and they're truer to us now than they even were. James keeps saying, like, he didn't know how right he was. And I think there's something to that. Like, I don't know. What do you think about, how do I turn that into a question? Benito Sereno, is it not?
I think it goes the intent and artistic, to what degree did Hitchcock know what he was doing?
Yeah.
Half the time. There's so many layers of brilliance in those movies. To what degree is that intentional?
And I don't
know, to what degree,
to what degree
Melville, and it's like, there's so much going on.
But it also comes across this, like, metaphysics, or is it politics? It's like, he's showing us these insoluble problem, these impasses at this moment. The impasse of flavor, for example, in the 1850s. But James is saying, well, but it's not, he's not saying there can be no other possibility. Right. It's not a hopeless book, but it's also not a kind of edifying narrative. It's like, this is a problem.
Yeah, it is true that it ends pretty bleakly, but there's a lot of, there's a lot of joy. There's Ishmael's overcoming his Western alienation by losing himself in Queequeg and the pre-modern savage. There's all of that, like, squeezing the sperm and losing your whole, overcoming the Western split of the psyche by just by dissolving yourself in squeezing other men's hands, and there's lots of moments of release and joy, and you get to Benito Sereno, and that's not, then it is much more of a bleak, bleak outcome.
The ending of your book, the epilogue, is actually an interesting play on that, right? There's sort of some hope in it. Yeah, it's an interplay. It's really interesting. It's pretty bleak. It's Grandin. It's Greg Grandin, so it's got to be pretty bleak. No,
well, remind us of what that end is, and we can end on that note.
It's a kind of. It's about. You mentioned the kind of the Civil War and the emancipation and the kind of the fact that Melville was wrong about the prediction. But obviously the ongoing ways of these traps. You end with David Bryan Davis kind of having engaged with this paradox over and over again. So it's returning to that paradox, but it's great. Yes.
Well, thank you guys.
Thank Greg.
Yeah, thank you.